Yeah, let's go. Hi guys, welcome to Young, Gifted and Deaf. If you didn't get that, yeah, we got that. Welcome to Young, Gifted and Deaf, episode 3. The topic of why I hid my deafness from the world, basically, or tried to. Anyway, we're talking to you guys about, the journey of discovery in terms of why I hid my deafness. It made me really want to question and go deeper and get to the root of the issues that deaf people, disabled people face. I'm going to be using this one to really try and get to the root of the issues of why deaf people suffer the way they do, why disabled people suffer the way they do. I've been absolutely astounded by some of the things that I've read. It's like, no, it might be bad for me here, but I'm really truly happy to be living as a disabled person in 2020. But it doesn't change the fact that I am now, as a disabled person, and other deaf people, other disabled people are suffering because of generations and generations of mistreatment and ill-formed beliefs about disability and how it impacts society. So let's get into it. Something causes the effects that we see. A lot of the issues that we face today are usually caused by some kind of systemic or institutionalized change, some kind of ideological viewpoint, and that causes many people to fight various issues, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's sexuality, whether it's disability, whatever. There's some kind of cause. For a deaf man, that causation can be found in disability and how disability has been viewed across the ages throughout. Because it's some things that I didn't know and it's just blowing my mind. Important. So today's gonna be a bit more energy. Drop your comments if you have anything you want to add, anything if it's and something I'm saying resonates with you, drop a comment. Get involved, let's have a discussion. Obviously the discussion has to start with me. So I'm going to talk about why I hid my deafness from the world for 32 years. It's a long time. Let's get to it. Something that I've always thought I'm going to have to address, because there's so many lies, so many mistruths, so many things that I've told different people to get around, my deafness, my issues or lack of hearing, so to speak. And because of that, I feel like it's important for me to address this. I recently came across a news report, I think it's from the National Deaf Society, and they're saying that 2 in 3 young deaf people will not put down that they are deaf on their job application. That's 2/3 of deaf young people won't say that they're deaf. And it made me think, because when I was applying for jobs, I wasn't telling people that I was deaf. I would be like, would you like to be ruled under equal rights, equality or whatever. And you would check that box because you felt like maybe it would give you, an opportunity to get in for an interview, regardless of what you're suffering. But in my case, I never got any interviews. So for me, or the next generation of deaf young people are not being filled with confidence, they're not being filled with the self-esteem that they need. It's a bit uncomfortable, I'm not even gonna lie. This is a weird topic for me because I don't actually remember ever being told that I have to hide my deafness. I had to hide my hearing aid. Bearing in mind, I didn't get a hearing aid until I was 11 years old. I feel like that may have played a part in why I felt like I had to hide. Prior to getting my hearing aid, everyone knew me as deaf or hard of hearing, but I didn't have a hearing aid. So there was no association. I was functioning, I was running, I was talking, I was holding conversations with people. So in their minds, I was able to hear, I was functioning as a normal person, but they knew that there was something not quite right with Sabian, right? So when you take that aspect and you add a hearing aid, You take something that was invisible but known about, or something that was people were aware of in their conscious but not necessarily seeing physically. You then take a hearing aid and you put that into the situation. Suddenly people are able to visualize your disability, visualize your illness, suddenly have something physical that helps them to understand, oh, he's deaf. And in that moment, when you get the hearing aid, for me, I suddenly began to realize how much different I was to everyone else. I was, for most intents and purposes, the only deaf person, the only person wearing a hearing aid in the room. So even if someone in your family, even if your friends and stuff aren't making you stand out, you still feel that way because you know you are different. People always look at the hearing aid, people always judge you based on that hearing aid. Your whole identity revolves around the hearing aid. The first thing people quip about when they see you is, what's that in your ear? And you hear, is that a hearing aid? Is that a headphone? What is it? You are aware, you suddenly become conscious of how people view you, and that causes you to go within yourself. So, for me, I was 11, and obviously 11 years old is around the time that everyone starts thinking about going to secondary school and all that stuff, and their friends. I went to a black school. I went to an all-black school. If you guys know about the Nation of Islam, then that's who I was known as a child. I was raised by the Nation of Islam. So we had an all-black school, and in that school, at 11, there were a lot of changes happening, internal changes happening. For me, I felt like there was a very big need to fit in as much as possible, not to be a strain on other people, not to be a burden on other people. I did so much to compensate for my lack of hearing in order to be seen as someone useful. So I would learn public speaking. I was, if you guys know military drilling, we were doing military drilling back then, and I was having to use my eyes back then to hear what an instructor was shouting out, to be able to hear, to be able to execute a command. I was doing all that compensation back then. I had a community around me who supported me no matter what. I had a community around me who didn't make me feel deaf. No, they didn't make me feel different. That allowed me to be free in my identity and not have to worry too much about it. It was when I left that environment and I went into college that all of that changed. Because suddenly there's all these different young people who from different backgrounds. Some come from Peckham, some come from Lewisham, one's a Hindu, one's Arab. There's so many different people. Suddenly you realize that amongst all these different people, you are the one person who has a hearing aid. So what do? You want to fit in. Everyone's joking at it, everyone's sizing each other up. Think about a college environment. You go into a college environment, everyone's thinking about, how can we get the girls, how we get the boys, they're thinking about wearing the latest clothes. Back then it was Averex, and everyone was wearing Averex, and that's how people were thinking about their clothes. And as a deaf person, you're there in that environment, and you don't have that level of access, you don't have the access to money, you don't have the access to opportunities to get a job and stuff, because you haven't been taught how. The job seekers advice and all the stuff. I never told anyone I was deaf when I went to college. The only people that knew I was deaf was the people who funded my education to get into college, because I went to college when I was 15. And so I used to wear a hat all the time, innit?
You saw a hat a lot?
Yeah, I used to wear a hat all the time. I think, in order to hide my deafness, I was always wearing a beanie hat. Lewis, my videographer, I'm very thankful to him for giving me the opportunity to use his camera. He was in college with me. I think he was probably the first person, I think you were actually the first person who figured out I was deaf. But I think when you figured out that I was deaf, that's when I stopped buying my hearing aid altogether.
Oh.
But at the same time, I had an issue for some reason of being associated with deaf people, because there were some other deaf people in there, but they all use sign language. I didn't. Obviously, you're 15, 16, there's stigmas about deafness, everyone's making jokes about disability. I'm not gonna, I was one of those people, I made jokes about, depression and mental health. I was foolish enough to think that depression and mental health was about having a strong or weak mind, stuff, and then depression hit me, just smacked me down. This is how we learn, we just, the only way we learn is by making these foolish mistakes. When we learn from those mistakes, it's not just about committing them, it's about learning from them, I suppose.
More conversational.
When I think about why I hid my deafness, I just find I can't pick. I could feel that there was some kind of sentiment, attitude, there was something there that just tells me that I needed to hide. It's probably in the form of comparisons. It could be, so after social comparison, that you're immediately made aware of the fact that you are different to everyone else. And even though you have all your abilities, you have all your functions, you might just one thing that people can't actually see that you miss, but because you have something in your ear, they're aware of it. And that makes you self-conscious. You're immediately thinking, well, I don't want to be looked at as some kind of burden. I don't want to be looked at as different to everyone else. I don't want to be treated differently to everyone else. You understand? Because you suddenly begin to see the changes in how people relate to you. Even if someone saw that I had a hearing aid, whether they said it or not, there was something in their eyes. And it's a great point, because everyone was trying to fit in, but the difference was I was trying to fit in with all the people that were trying to fit in. Those people, even though they were trying to fit in, they had their huddles, they had their groups, to understand, that they had their cliques, they had that understanding, a little bit of history there. Understand? I was just a deaf kid who came and just appeared out of nowhere. I didn't go to any of the schools that you guys were talking to me about. Sure, sir, talking to me about tennis, and I didn't go to any of those schools. I had nothing in common with those people. Understand? I was just a black deaf boy, but obviously I wanted people to focus on the black boy bit. I was hoping to get some girls, I was hoping to get to the styles. So if I couldn't, my deafness, my hearing aid was a hindrance. That's probably the honest way to say it was a hindrance to me back then. I saw it, you're trying to create your identity in the world, and stuff, and you've got that peer pressure to fit in, you've got that, it's a hindrance to how other people see you and how they'll therefore interact with you. That makes sense. I suppose a lot of it comes down to perception as well. How we perceive how others view us, and everything. Does that make sense? And I remember in college I was shook to be anywhere near you, because I just knew there was something. You like to ask questions, and I hated that. I hated people who asked questions, because people who asked questions would eventually find out that I was deaf. You understand? I used to keep myself away from people who asked too many questions. I like to hang around people who let me do asking all the questions I ask. I find out everything about you. You ain't gonna find a damn thing about me, or test what I tell you that I want you to find out about me. Do you understand? So a lot of that, but it was also an identity thing. Somehow I felt like my identity was wrapped around my deafness. You understand? Before I had my hearing aid, I didn't feel that. I felt I was normal. But the moment I got the hearing aid, suddenly I felt like my identity was attached to my hearing aid. But everything about how I viewed myself involved the hearing aid. I couldn't see myself as a good-looking guy without thinking about it. I couldn't look at my looks without thinking about my hearing aid. I look at the mirror, and the first thing I'm seeing before I see my face is my hearing aid. You understand? That was a big thing for me. I didn't even see my blackness first. I saw my deafness first, you understand? That impacted how I interacted with other people. I'd always wearing a beanie hat, always wearing the beanie hat, and that hat got washed maybe 3 times a year. And I'm pretty sure that hat is the reason why I'm bald right now, because all that sweat and stuff like that was the extent. I'd rather go bald and let you find out that I'm deaf. That's how deep it was. So it's interesting though, because I think about all the times that I tried to have a relationship with girls and tried to, or you know, you're understanding them back then, it was all about getting the numbers and all that stuff. The weird thing for me that even though people knew I was deaf, I hid the fact that I was deaf, and therefore I was held to the same expectations as a non-deaf man, which was back then in the teens, you had to get the numbers. If you weren't getting numbers, you like, who are you? Do you understand? So, so for me, that was like my into, well, back then, when you have a hearing aid and you're trying to move to a girl, I'm sorry, at 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, back then, there was not one girl really, well there was one girl, there's not really one girl that would really be, at least in my mind, want to be sitting with a partner who had a hearing aid. In those ages, like there was not one girl, and we knew some Chris girls in college, and there was no way I was gonna take off my hat and let them know that I had to understand. So there was a lot of confidence, there was a lot of internal battles going on that I couldn't seem to get past. Couldn't get past those battles. It made it hard for me to present myself to the world as I should have. You understand? I would have all kind of lies and excuses as to why I was wearing my hat all the time. I would turn up, I'm sure some of my friends, you know, from my estate would tell you, I would turn up on a Sunday on a sweltering hot 32-degree day with my beanie hat on my head to play football for 6 hours. Concept that I had to try and think about then. Alright, I didn't actually feel any pressure. I didn't actually care. I really keep hating when I keep saying it. I didn't hear. Like, what else am I gonna do? Like,
I didn't even put it over.
No, I couldn't. I didn't lip read anyone telling me. I find it interesting that I still adopt that or adopted that way of living. I feel like the pressure or the spotlight of being the only person who's wearing a hearing aid. It's not even just being deaf, it's the only person who's wearing a hearing aid, because it's more about the visual aspect that gets people. Because if I take my hearing aid off, no one knows I'm deaf. You understand? That was the other side of life, is that when I decided that I was going to stop wearing my hat, I also stopped wearing my hearing aids. Then it became a thing where I looked normal, but I wasn't really able to hold conversation. I had to guess my way through conversation. That's another one. I'm still doing it now. I have a conversation and I'm nodding. I'm like, yeah. Acting like I can hear what they're saying, and I've not heard a word that they say. There's so many conversations. When I look back, So many conversations that when I recall the memories of that conversation, I realize I didn't actually hear what the other person or those people in that room were saying. I used to be a part of a football team, and I ever didn't wear my hearing aid or wore my hearing aid under a hat, but it used to get dark when we were training, so you couldn't really see each other. I never used to be able to hear what the manager was saying, so I couldn't follow tactics, and therefore I was useless.
Well,
when I look back, I can only blame myself because there was no enforcement from other people. But without realizing it, we don't realize that there's another aspect to it that we're totally unaware of. That is the weight of history, and that just weighs down on us, so to speak, and presents itself in every step that we take now. When you really get to the deep, like really get your hands in the mud, in the dirt, try to figure out why would a deaf person who not one person has ever said to me, wear a hat to hide your hearing aid. Why no shouldn't made any negative, well they have, but made any direct negative comments about my deafness and encouraging me to hide my deafness. Why would a deaf man in that situation still feel in need to hide his identity? Something that I felt a need to explore a bit further, and that's why this podcast, is really, it's been influenced by. I lost my train of thought. But what I'm basically saying is something that we're missing in this conversation when we talk about deaf people adopting and embracing their identity. I find the answer to that in a word that I learned from the time of studying law. I studied access to law for 1 year, and there's one word that always stuck with me, and it's causation. Causation. Causation is basically the relationship between cause and effect. When I think about my inability to take on my identity and accept my deaf identity, I have to try and categorize it as one of two things. It's either a cause of something or an effect of something. Understand? That's how that's how you are able to get to the root of the issues that impact you in your life, get to the cause of it. You are already suffering from the effects of it. But now you have to go back to the cause. Stop a leak from wiping up what's on the floor. You have to get to the source of the leak, right? And the source of the leak in these situations is in the history of how disabled people have been viewed and treated around the world. I've seen certain things in even just UK history, in the Bible, how the Bible talks about deaf people, that stuff is more of a waste of punishment. You understand? Your parents did something wrong, so if the child comes out, disabled, parents, sees that as a punishment, and that attitude is an attitude that's being pushed on parents, Afro-Caribbean parents have held that attitude. If their child comes out disabled, they've been punished for some sin, some transgression that they did 900 years ago. You understand? And because of that attitude passes on to the child without realizing that child consumes that belief that their parent has. You understand? Mm-hmm. That then becomes the identity of that disabled or that deaf child. Your parents have consumed an ideology that starts way before they were even born. You've heard of eugenics? Yeah, the science of improving the human race, basically. Yeah. And then Julian Huxley wrote in 1930, what are we going to do? Every defective man, woman and child is a burden. Every defective is an extra body for the nation to feed and clothe, but produces little or nothing in return. In the early 20th century, scientists began to believe that disability was actually a threat to the health of the nation, and therefore they needed to be purified, they needed to be restored, they needed to be healed. That created over 320 asylums were created. That's one asylum for every 20 miles, and disabled and poor people were just slumped in there and isolated from the rest of society deliberately because they were defective. Even though people may not be thinking it consciously, generations ago they were. And now you've got policy to change policy, you've used the laws to maybe pacify people, to make people think that things have changed, but they haven't really. And I feel like it's that history, it's that understanding of how simple moments in history just change the trajectory of someone's life. To the point where I'm at my age in 2020 and I'm still impacted by the same thing as disabled people were in the 1800s, 1700s, 1600s. That to me is something that is worthy of discussing. It's worthy of thinking about, because it's like, alright then, how much of this have we still consumed? How much of this belief system is still running through our veins about disabled people?